Hello everybody and welcome to another video tutorial. Now for this video tutorial I'm working on an Imperial room, and I did base a lot of the inspiration and design elements off Roman building structures and sculptures. For this design actually took quite a long time to do. It actually took a combination of about 20 hours of work, simply because of the character intricacies that I was adding in there, as well as the amount of referencing that I had to do to figure out the structure and get it to look appropriate. So as you can see, I'm working on the main platform. Essentially this is a platform where people can approach the royalty and ask for different items or inquire about legal matters, and where the main decisions in this kingdom are actually made. So the platform itself is actually fairly simple at the moment. You will see me adding a lot more patterns to it later on. Right now I'm just trying to figure out the basic overall structure of this inside of the building. Once I figured out the basic structure, then I can actually begin adding in the columns and the sculptures, which will be essentially throughout the walls, adding a bit more of a intricate and nobility look to this entire image, because I do want to show that the person in charge in this area is of nobility, is powerful, and obviously has quite a bit of monetary gain to them because they have a lot of resources. Now I am experimenting with the columns to see what type of design I'm going to end up with. Once I figured out the basic design elements, I create essentially a template, and from this template I'll duplicate it and then modify it and then do a final version of the columns. I create the templates just to make sure that they're uniform, they're the same size, and also to save time. What I did discover while I was working on this is that I needed to use the elliptical tool to get the proper perspective and the curves for the columns, at least in the initial stages for sure. The further columns you don't notice when you just use the pen tool, but as you come closer to the viewer, the lines actually start looking a little wobbly. So I had to go in later on, and instead of just using the pen tool, I ended up having to use the elliptical tool instead, just to get proper curves for the ellipses. Now, the initial rough sketch that I used to create this image is actually not a digital sketch, it's actually something I did in my sketchbook. I had a couple of sketches in my sketchbook that I liked, and I decided that it would be a good exercise to see if I could make these in a digital medium. I sometimes do this, not so much for layouts normally, but it's probably going to be something actually that I do a bit more often. Because I do find that sketching background layouts by hand tends to be really fast, and also I'm able to get more detailed information as I go. Now there is a difference between the two though. I do find that when I'm doing digital work I can zoom in a lot more. I can also pre-work the perspective a bit better. So the final rendition of my sketches in digital format tend to actually be more accurate to the final version that I will end up using. So that's the main difference between those. But I do find I get a lot more detail by simply drawing it by hand, and it's incredibly fast in comparison. So at this point I believe I've decided that I'm going to actually redo this portion, just because the ellipses don't look correct, they look wobbly. And you just can't have that in a drawing, because it does show, especially in this angle. So I simply redid them. I added the ellipses on separate layers so that I can modify them if I needed to. But since I already had a rough template below it, it was pretty quick to do, so it didn't waste too much time. Now at this point I have to really watch perspective on that top portion of the columns, because I'm going to have to modify it as I go to make sure that it looks correct perspective wise. And I'm essentially doing the rough box around them so that I can figure it out a bit easier, and this does save a lot of time. I went in and I've noticed that some of the tops there weren't the correct size, so I just modified those. So I'm just adding some of the detail work in these columns. I'm using the pen tool to create the curve, and then I just hold down the shift key and move downwards with my brush to add the rest of the line. Almost every single different portion of this layout is on a different layer in case I have to work on it separately. And I know I'm going to, because I'm going to have to mask out quite a few areas. The question is, which areas are going to end up having to be masked out? So by having these all in a separate layer, at least initially before I compress it, it does help save a lot of time. I can also go back to it, and if I was actually doing a digital painting, I can add these into groups, mask them out further to help emphasize different structures. And I am debating whether or not to paint this all in one layer or to actually show the process that I would actually approach this if I was doing freelance work for a company, because generally you would actually separate out the different portions so that it's easier to use in an animation setting. Just adding these main structures are actually going to help support the sculptures that are going to go into the wall formations. I did change them from the original sketch just because I thought actually showing sceneries would actually be more appropriate. Now, what I could have done is I could have actually just done one sculpture and then duplicated it if I wanted to and just done some modifications. That would have taken less time, but this layout is more of an exercise on perspective rather than anything else, so adding a bit of variety is actually a bit better because then I'm going to get more practice out of this. I'm not drawing this to make it easy, I'm drawing this because I want to learn from this image. I also have an update as of the posting of this video. I do have an update on the book that I was talking about in last week's video. So it is in its final stages of editing, so hopefully within the next couple weeks it will be completed and it will be available, and I will be including the link. If you happen to be viewing this video later on, it should be added into the description in the bottom of this video. So just keep that in mind if you're interested in actually purchasing a book that has some of these images. That's the best way to do it. And it has a lot of my works that I have not actually shown online either, so you're going to get a lot more of those items in there. So I'm just sketching out the poses for the characters. And I generally do everything really rough, and then I go in and I just clean up the line work. So I'm testing out whether or not the same techniques that I'm using for the line work for the layout will work well for the characters. So essentially I'm using a really rough brush right now to sketch out the details for the main structures and the main sculptures, and once I have those, I'm going to go in and clean those all up. And I do want to make sure, since this is the main sculpture, that the anatomy and proportions are correct, as close as I can get. And I do end up modifying a lot of the structure and proportions depending on some of the cloth-like elements that I'll be adding. Since this is being posted on YouTube, I will be covering the frontal portion of the human anatomy to accommodate for individuals who may have sensitivities to such images. Figuring out the structure on the foot. It's really important that I fully flesh out the structure of that foot and make sure that it is appropriate for this image. Like I said, it's a main focal point, so making sure that all of the structure works is extremely important, because it's going to reflect heavily on the surrounding images and structure that you see. So just roughing out the pedestal. And doing the same with those wall structures, because these are actually sculpted into the wall. So the brush that I'm using is actually a sketching brush that I created a while back. I did follow the instructions from a different artist while creating it. And I do like this brush a lot for sketching out detail, because it does simulate a actual pencil quite well. So right now I'm actually cleaning up the line work, so I am using the default hard brush for this. So in the initial stages, I'll add regular lines to the image, and then I'll break them up so that they look more organic. This allows me to add essentially line weight into areas that would have stronger lines anyway, and it helps distinguish different portions of the body as well. Since this was the main focal point, I did spend a lot more time on this one revising the structure and the anatomy, and also the proportions as I went, because like I said, it's a main focal point. I was looking at reference material also as I was working, looking at Greek and Roman sculptures to get an idea of some of the anatomy that they would have exaggerated and how they would have gone about it, and also a bit of the posing as well. So this actually helped a lot my posing, because they do have very dynamic posing in most cases. It was also very beneficial for the cloth elements, because of I'm using only lines essentially, and broken up lines to define these structures. It's really important that it looks appropriate and looks like cloth. So I just sketch it out initially, and then I go in and I clean up all of the line work. And I use the pen tool heavily for this, just because it gives me better results. Once I had this main structure done, it was much easier to figure out how I was going to approach the cleanup work for the rest of the sculptures. Since this has the most detail work, it essentially acts as a guide for the style of the cleanup work. Okay, so I'm just working on the pedestal now. This part is actually quite complicated structure-wise, because I do have the two side portions, and the perspective is changing on this angle as well. So I did have to do quite a bit of tweaking for the structure on the right side after I was done. Just starting to work on those background elements. I only recorded a certain portion of this because, like I said, it took over 20 hours to do. I spent probably another 3 hours adding some finer details afterwards, that you'll see in the final image at the end of this video. Because this video was so long, I didn't want to make it any longer than it had to be. So as I'm working on this, I'm also deciding whether or not I'm going to actually cover up these characters once again, because I do realize that there's certain individuals online that do have strong sensitivities to such content. I'm going to be adding some cloth to cover up regions of their body. So as you can see, I'm figuring out the structure and the orientation for the heads before I actually start working out the details of these heads. And these spears, essentially what I've done is I've put those on a separate layer so I can mask out any areas that wouldn't be seen. So I'm adding the same or a similar column design to this background. And I'll be doing a different one for essentially each of these images, just to help add a bit of variation into the image. Now I am debating also what type of stonework will be actually used for these images. I'm contemplating actually trying to paint in a marble-like texture by hand. We'll see how that goes though. I may have to do some tests to see if it's feasible. Most people would actually just use a texture that already exists to get that effect. I may use specialty brushes, but I'm going to see if it's possible to paint it in instead. Once again, just figuring out the structure to make sure that's as close as I can get to the real thing before I start adding in any details. And it's really important to plot in that reference line for the head because it makes such a big difference in the final image if it's lined up correctly. Just breaking up the line work, and I break up the line work essentially using a very simple method. I essentially just use the eraser tool to erase out the parts of the lines that I don't want to keep, and that generally works out really well. Now after I finish this first column, I duplicate it onto the other side and change the visibility so that I can use it as a reference. So I'll modify the perspective a little bit and do the changes that are necessary to make it look more realistic. The arches are something that are very important in this case. They help add structural integrity as well as adding some interest visually to the image, so it's something that I've really tried to incorporate. Just adding the sash-like material. Once again, I'm following very similar structure to that initial sculpture to make sure it's consistent. At this point, I'm pretty comfortable with how I've broken down the process for these characters. So I'm just doing all the characters at once so that I can do all the columns at the same time. And this essentially speeds up my workflow a little bit because I'm not having to go back and think about the different structure. I'm just working on the structure of the ceiling now, because the rest of the image is so detailed. It's important that I add at least a little bit of detail work into the ceiling. Currently I do have some additional guild work that I've added in I may add some more information depending on how I see it. So there could be differences in the line work by the time this is actually painted digitally as well. So just figuring out roughly what type of structure I was going to do for that top part. I'm breaking up the line work now. And there are certain places that I decide to keep the full line work and not break it up. Essentially these are areas where the structure would be more pronounced. The trick with the cloth is to make it look like it's somewhat form-fitting and makes sense, but still loose. And that's something that you have to do sometimes a couple renditions to get the proper balance between the two. And it is really important, because if you don't get the proper balance, it just seems off. Filling up the columns into each of these images. And just adding the foliage. In the final image, what I actually did is I masked out any areas behind the foliage so that the foliage stands out more. So it's just something to make sure that it looks appropriate and it's not as distractive as well. What I generally do for the layers that I know I'm going to be painting is I actually separate these out into groups and add an overall mask to them so that it looks more realistic. So I'm just adding curtains essentially for the area where the nobility will be sitting. And most of it is hidden in this case. Just working on the floor. And now I have essentially started working on separating out different elements into their separate groups and masking out areas that should be masked out so that you can see the appropriate amount of detail that's actually in there. This helps clarify everything. Also makes it a lot easier for painting, because now at this point, because everything's separated out into groups, I'll be able to paint this a lot easier. So I'm just experimenting with custom shapes, seeing whether or not I'll be able to use it to create patterns. I actually decided to go with a brush instead. And this doesn't always work, it depends on what you're doing. It worked really well on the base, so I kept it on the base. The reason why it worked well there is because essentially it was closer to the horizon line, so it's closer to being flat, so when I distorted that image, it looked like it was in the correct perspective. Okay, so I'm breaking up the lines on the floor. And adding the chair for the royalty and some background there. So this is the final image. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys soon. So thank you and take care.